So good day to everyone. I'd like to welcome you all on day 2 of this IPBES online conference. And our objective with this conference is to look at the interlinkages between the Sustainable Development Goals related to water, food, health, biodiversity, and climate change. And of course, our ultimate objective is to look at synergies, trade-offs, co-benefits between all of these 5 elements with a view to understand which pathways would allow us to reach simultaneously all of these sustainable development goals and not just a few at the expense in particular on biodiversity, as it is often the case. So yesterday, it was day 1 of our online conference, and I had the opportunity to present on IPBES, to bring on board people who might not be familiar with IPBES, what has been achieved during our first work program and what is being envisaged during the new IPBES work program up to 2030, and that presentation is posted. So for the newcomers today, we invite you to go to this presentation, which will then give you all of the elements you need to continue to contribute to IPBES. Yesterday, we also heard from speaker number 1 for day 1, Lutando Dziba, who introduced the Nexus as a whole and who then also introduced yesterday's topic, which was water and linkages. He gave that presentation, following which there was an opportunity for about an hour and a half or so for a lively exchange with participants. And the objective was for people who were on the call to propose some questions that the future Nexus assessment would be addressing. So our objective today is not to actually address those questions, but it's really to collect questions that you feel would be important, particularly pertaining to these linkages that I just mentioned. So, and then we opened our online forum yesterday so that people could send written contributions, and that online forum for written contributions is going to stay open until the end of the online conference tomorrow. So today we intend to do just the same and to focus on health, which is today's topic. Tomorrow's topic will be food. So today for the topic of health, we will also have a 2-hour webinar, which will start with an introduction, and I will introduce the speaker shortly. Then there will be an hour and a half for exchanges. You will be invited to intervene, pose your questions, and after that, we will close that live segment, and we will open for the forum for a written input. So just this one slide that you see here to really make sure that everyone understands where we are at in this journey that will lead us to a new IPBES report, which for short we call the Nexus Assessment in a few years from now. So we are really at the very early stages. As you can see here, the IPBES plenary back in May asked for IPBES to pre-scope first and then to scope this Nexus assessment. So today we are at this pre-scoping conference, and what we would like to do, as I just said, is to collect input from all of you, from a large diversity of interested stakeholders, and we would like to hear from you what questions you have that the future assessment would address. Now we're going to collect all of this, and we will give that to the people who will be selected to attend the scoping meeting in March. The call for nominations of experts is currently open until 15th of October. So if you are interested in being considered to be selected for that meeting, please apply. And then that group would be charged with producing a scoping report, which is like a roadmap for that assessment. It would include a set of chapters, what those chapters would contain, very short, and then also based on that, it would also, contain a timeline, a budget. So that is called the scoping report. And on that basis, then IPBES 8 in February 2021 would decide to initiate the assessment, allocate a budget, following which there would be a call for experts, and the assessment would start over a period of 3 to 4 years. So as you see, we are embarking upon a bit of a trip with that report. And today is really the first time that the community at large is invited to contribute. So as I said, today we focus on health, and I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. This is Dr. Peter Daszak. Peter has been at the forefront of science policy regarding health issues, and in particular regarding the emergence of diseases and their ecological origin. His research has really been instrumental in understanding the origin of several major diseases, such as the origin of SARS in bats, for example. The severe acute respiratory syndrome is one of the founders of conservation medicine. So really, really at the core of what health and biodiversity mean and how they relate to each other, and is the president of EcoHealth Alliance, which is an organization that conducts research as well as outreach programs on global health, conservation, and development. So I'm happy to give you the floor, Peter, to introduce that topic on health and linkages.
Well, thank you very much, Anne, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be able to do this, and I think, yes, we're the beginning of an exciting journey, but one which will be extremely productive, I believe. So I want to start by just sort of talking about the, one second. Here we go. The focus of today's session. So we have really this orange part of the circle, and the interactions between health, food and water are very complex, and there's a lot of overlap. So there'll be some overlap with what those of you on the call yesterday would have heard and what you will hear later on today. And the key thing today is to focus down on this and get your suggestions on really the scope of the assessment, how wide we should go, and what specific questions we should try and address. Now, I've really thought of health and their interrelations and linkages with these other areas in 3 thematic areas. First of all, the relationships between biodiversity and health, the underpinnings of what happens with climate change and global environmental change in general and health, and how well that's been addressed. And then the linkages between food and water and health, which obviously underpin a great deal of human economic and development and welfare. There is a very complex policy framework that already brings health in. And I think one of the key issues that we can start to think about is how well does this policy framework really deal with this complexity, this nexus interlinkages among these different issues. When we think about, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, health is one of them. Promoting health around the world and bringing people's health and welfare up in status is an obvious goal for us as a species. But what about the linkages with every other SDG, gender equity, sustainability, climate, terrestrial ecosystems? Are these well addressed yet, and how can we do this better? And then we look at other policy frameworks. For instance, there's a very significant effort around health and security that has a lot of funding and a lot of policy effort from some countries. How well does that issue bring in the biodiversity linkages and the global environmental change linkages to health. And those are the things that I think that the assessment can begin to address, and hopefully we'll talk about that later. When we proceed with the assessment, we've been tasked to use what's known as a One Health approach, which really is a movement that began a few decades ago to show the linkages between human health, where most of the energy and concern is, animal health, and that can be wildlife or livestock, and the environment. And there is a huge field of environmental health out there that's doing a lot of work on this. So if we consider these different components of our ecosystem, each has its own health issues, but each are linked to each other. And there's a very complex linkages among those, which brings in a great deal of different disciplines. And then when we add to that climate change, global environmental change, how does that drive health issues across these sectors, and especially where they overlap? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But let's start off with the first of those three issues, the impact of biodiversity and health. And I think that one thing we can straight away look at, we talk about co-benefits, we talk about the positive side of biodiversity for human health. There are some incredible ecosystem services around health that we are fortunate to acquire from biodiversity. Some of the key pharmaceutical compounds used in health around the world are derived from biodiversity. And there is, back in the 50s, most drug companies would be out around the world looking for new fungal species or new plant species that contain potential drugs, antimicrobial drugs, drugs like penicillin, which of course now are under great threat from antimicrobial resistance. So this could be a very important area for the future. And of course, the most biodiversity is found in countries that have probably the less capacity to go out there and find these compounds. So there's an intellectual property issue around this, which I think is going to be very interesting to look at. Another service from biodiversity that directly goes to our health, human health, are the links between biodiversity and feeling good, good mental health, outdoor activity, fitness, lack of disease, linked to open spaces, parks and forests. There's been quite a bit of work scientifically on that and really good evidence to underpin that. But it's often forgotten when we think about health and we focus on other big issues like the emergence of an Ebola virus somewhere on the planet, or obesity, or air pollution. And let's not forget as well the diversity of plants and animals that lead to our dietary diversity, which drives nutritional health, and the continued drive of globalized agriculture to produce monocultures that undermine sometimes our nutritional health. And I think that's going to be a very interesting issue to get into. It directly applies to health and welfare and fits in with many of the SDGs. Finally, there's a great deal of work that points to biodiversity, or rather intact ecosystems, as a way to reduce the risk of health impacts from infectious diseases and the so-called dilution effect. Some of those areas where this works are going to be very important. It's unknown how widely this is a generalizable rule, but clearly underpins a need for conservation of intact ecosystems to protect our health and other ecosystem service. And just a few examples briefly of how biodiversity can be undermined by health impacts. This is over the last few decades, the decline in honey producing colonies of bees in the US. And this is a global phenomenon linked to a couple of key issues. One is the use of pesticides, which is very controversial. The other is the spread of mites, a vector that carries a series of viral diseases of bees that has been spread around the world by honey producers. So although this is a managed wild species, the honeybee is under serious pressure and represents the issue of pollinators, which was covered in the previous IPBES assessment. But the role of health in those declines is critically important. As we lose biodiversity, in some cases, we put ourselves at risk of health issues. If you move from the left-hand side of this slide to the right, we look at an intact forest region. This is for the USA, North America, Canada. And these are the species that you find in intact forests. As you move into urban areas, they're replaced. We lose biodiversity and they're replaced by introduced species. We also see a rise in the habitat for mosquitoes that spread diseases like West Nile virus and others. And there's a clear link between urbanization and increased risk of mosquito-borne disease and a direct correlation with biodiversity loss. So there are some clear, interesting links that have huge impact, both in health, welfare, and economics. And finally, biodiversity itself is under pressure from disease-mediated extinction. About a third of the original Hawaiian bird fauna has been lost due to introduced avian malaria. There's a rise in fungal diseases in bats, a globally significant emerging disease in amphibians, which is a fungal disease spread by people through trade in various products. These have led to extinction events. And I think it's important to put that into context. If we're really truly going to look at the interactions between biodiversity and health, the most extreme of biodiversity loss is extinction. And here we have real examples that we can tie into to understand what's driving that. Now let's look at the second thematic area, global environmental change, climate change, and health. And so just to look at two examples, land use change and climate change. Of course, they're very strongly interlinked. Land use change is driven often by agricultural crop production. And these pictures are from Southeast Asia, where there's an incredible focus on palm oil, a very profitable crop. And burning forest, especially peat forest, to clear land for palm oil production leads to health impacts. So land use change, the process of land use change, leads to haze events which spread across Southeast Asia. We've seen similar issues in the Amazon this year, and this is a global phenomenon. And those haze events cause respiratory illness, they increase death, they have huge economic cost as people close offices and schools to keep people away from the air pollution. Likewise, as we clear land, we bring in mosquitoes that are adapted to human habitat. And we've seen increased malaria cases in palm oil plantations in Southeast Asia, in forest fragments in South America. We also see increased risk of other diseases as people move into these areas and start to hunt wildlife and become exposed. So that's the negative side of land use change for health, but also we have to acknowledge the positive side of land use change for health. Agricultural development in general raises the income of the local population and increases health and well-being. Very few studies have really started to look at the interactions and the balance, the co-benefits and losses between these processes. And I think that would be a really interesting opportunity for this assessment. And just to give you an example, if you look at emerging diseases, which are very significantly important in terms of economics as well as health, about 31% of them are driven by deforestation, agricultural intensification, land use change drivers, including some very significant diseases like Ebola, SARS, zoonotic malaria. And those have a very big impact. There's a lot of money, funding, and energy and personnel used to combat those diseases. Very little focus on the underlying drivers which are directly related to biodiversity. Let's look briefly at climate change and its impact on health. Since the first IPCC report, and this was a very important issue of Nature that came out after the IPCC report, we saw really a focus on the air pollution impacts, both in terms of heat events, heat stress leading to health issues, and air pollution itself leading to health issues. We also have extreme weather events, which cause, obviously, significant health issues. So this has been known for a long time. There's been quite a lot of work on this, and the assessment will have an opportunity, I think, to bring this together into one place and make the issue of the size of these impacts and the underlying mortality and economic impact of climate change on health, both in terms of these direct effects through heat and air pollution and through things like infectious disease burden. And we've already seen climate change driving the spread of new diseases and driving the spread of known diseases where they're endemic, like plague in Central Asia. The blue tongue outbreak, which was an outbreak of livestock, a viral disease in livestock, very significant in Europe, was driven by climate change pushing the vectors of this disease across the Mediterranean into mainland Europe. And there are a whole series of examples of this, but again, very few assessments have really brought these into one place. I think that is a great opportunity too. To look at the last two aspects, food and water. Food and health, now we've already got a focus from one of the sections of this symposium series on food. But the interactions between food and health are really complex and important, underpinning nutritional diversity and this direct link to biodiversity and the biodiversity of available crop products, which every year is diminished, has a very significant role in health. Intensification of agriculture, livestock production especially, drives economic growth and welfare, but also provides this underpinning of the obesity problem globally, of diabetes, and not just in the richer countries now, but in many middle-income countries too, and drives equity issues which are really hard to deal with and understand from a policy perspective. And this global livestock production, which the planet really depends on now, is linked directly to health in many different ways. One of those ways is that global livestock production and trade drives the circulation of pathogens. And here we've got the example of flu, which influenza pandemics are driven by the interaction between wild birds, between those and domestic birds, pigs and humans, where the virus reassorts and evolves across this milieu. And it's directly related to this one health approach. Where a virus emerges, it then gets into the global travel and trade system and rapidly spreads. So we really are at a position in our planet where we're supremely susceptible to these pandemics, which have, although they're rare events, they have a very significant impact. If we look at the recent outbreaks of a few diseases like SARS or the H1N1 so-called swine flu or Ebola, the economic shocks that these cost to the system through this globalized network are in the tens of billions. And we can estimate, if you follow that increasing this really exponential rise in economic cost, over the next 30 years, about $2 to $3 trillion US dollars impact on the global economic system. The equivalent of a depression, a global depression, many hurricanes, many earthquakes. So these are big system issues, which again haven't really been dealt with in their relationship to biodiversity in a good way. If you look at these diseases, almost all of them originate in animals, usually wildlife, and are driven to emerge through global environmental change. Finally, the interactions between water, both freshwater and marine, are really significant. There's a direct impact on our health through pollution of drinking water, clearly, and through pollution of the sea. There's been a huge interest in microplastics, and we're really just beginning to see the beginnings of what that impact is and the ubiquity of microplastics throughout every aspect of life. But climate change is going to drive a series of health issues in the future. It already is around water, both freshwater and marine, whether that's through the direct health impacts of rising seas and extreme weather events, or through the spread of vector-borne disease, mosquito-borne and tick-borne diseases, which we're already seeing in many parts of the world. So I want to finish with just presenting some ideas, some sort of examples of policy relevant questions we can start to think about to get the discussion going. Because what we really want to hear now is from you, where you think this assessment should go in terms of health linkages, how broad it should be, and what specific questions. So a couple of ideas on the benefits of biodiversity to health. How severe will future biodiversity loss affect potential benefits in terms of the drugs that could be used positively for human health that are present in biodiversity that haven't yet been discovered? And there is some work on that we can look into. How are these issues built into conservation strategies globally and intellectual property rights globally? A very thorny issue which directly, I think, directly feeds into IPBES's role in terms of understanding biodiversity. On the environmental change, climate change issues, how do scenarios of climate change mitigation affect health? Will we see, can we use this to better leverage those mitigation strategies? Will policymakers accept the cost of climate change mitigation better if they see such direct benefits to health? This interesting issue, the second one, of national policies on land use. We have the private sector benefits of agricultural production. Private companies usually do the development and make a lot of profit. And then we have the public sector economic and health impacts from air pollution or disease. How are those two squared away, or are they just completely ignored in different sectors? What can policies do to change that? And then, as I mentioned before, the idea of the frameworks that are out there now, how can we better link the underlying environmental drivers of health issues to those frameworks, and bringing in issues like the WHO, the World Health Organization's R&D framework, which drives vaccine and drug development, and how does that play into biodiversity issues? Finally, on water, food and health, how do ecosystem services that are clearly there for health from freshwater and marine environments play into the policies that we've got in place? Are they brought in properly? And what is the role of the private sector versus public sector in protecting against the impacts of globalized food production? And is this the sectorization of those two issues? Does that drive these issues to be ignored in terms of policy? So those are some ideas, and I really wanted now to hand back over to Anne, who can get the discussion going and hear from some of your questions already.